The goal of this video is to break down the various components of an original advocacy and show you how to construct them into a compelling outline. The best thing that you can do, though, to get a strong grasp over the various aspects of OA is to read as many state finalist speeches as possible. You have access to all of them on Canvas, so you should make good use of those resources. The more you study and break down the components of those speeches, the better off you'll be able to construct a powerful speech all on your own. That said, let's look at the various components of an OA. The first one is the introduction, and it always starts with a hook and transition. We're going to go into the intro in much more depth a bit later, but once you start writing your speech, it's important to start brainstorming ideas for the intro. Every speech should start off with an entertaining opening vehicle to engage or hook your audience. It can be a personal anecdote, an analogy, a series of jokes, a story, etc. You have a lot of room to be creative here, but the important thing is that it should be humorous and it needs to have relevance to your topic. So you should be able to transition smoothly to the topic without having an abrupt leap in logic that leaves your audience scratching their head wondering how you went from point A to point B. So if I just stood up and started saying knock-knock jokes and then transitioned to the United States dealing with economic woes or high healthcare costs, that wouldn't make sense unless those knock-knock jokes had something to do with high healthcare costs. Again, I'm not going to go into too many examples right now. I'm going to save that for a later video. But if you want to learn more, my biggest tip is to read as many OAs as possible that I've posted on Canvas. And also another good place would be actually to watch the national finalists' original orators online. Why? Because the introduction is actually quite similar between the two events. And I think watching OOers, they're usually a lot better at this than OAers, give those humorous intros will help to give you a lot of good ideas. After the hook and transition, then you typically build towards a statement of significance within your intro. And that's where you transition to the topic and forefront the seriousness of the topic and give the thesis statement of the speech. This is where you give a preview of what your topic is and why the topic matters. And it's important to give the audience a clear sense of where you're going to go right from the start. And you end the introduction with a divided roadmap. And you typically use the figurative imagery of your intro hook. So if you're making a ton of jokes about your dog growing up, maybe, or about pets in general, then your divided roadmap might use the language of pets, like, first, let's chase our dog down the street dive and to figure out what's going wrong before, second, getting a hold of our pet, and before finally, trapping them or something like that, right? That's not a great example. Regardless, you'll always break it into three parts: a beginning, a middle, and end. It's the way people like to think about stories, and your speech is functionally a story, even though it's a little bit more intellectual than most stories. So after the introduction, then you'll transition to harms. And harms is a really important place, right? This is where you're explaining what the problem is and its root cause. And ideally, this is informative and surprising to the judge. Now, a lot of what I have to say about harms was already echoed in my topic proposal video. Hopefully everything you did during the topic proposal stage has set you up for this part of the outline well. Why? Because this is where you need to have a topic and harms that affect the judge directly, have big problems, etc., all those things I was talking about. So if you still feel shaky on this and you have not gotten great feedback on your topic proposal, you absolutely need to work that out with varsity members of the team and me before really trying to take a crack at the rest of the outline. Why? Because if your harms and the topic itself are problematic and are not great, then you're fighting an insurmountable uphill battle. That said, as we're going into the harms, it's really important to show how the problem affects society negatively. And ideally, like I said in the topic proposal video, you are showing that it affects the judge directly, that it doesn't just affect a small group of individuals, that it really affects everybody in American society, or could affect everybody in American society. And eventually you'll want to build to the biggest impacts, right? People dying, or economic costs, or wasted tax dollars, or health impacts, or infringement of rights, etc., etc. And it's important that your impacts are both concrete and diversified. Now, I know this is pretty abstract at this point, so let's take a look at a state championship speech that does a great job of explaining the problem, the root cause, and its impacts here. So, this is a speech on tort law. Speaker says, "So what is tort law? While we'd all love this speech to be about grandma's chocolate torts, we're going to discuss the slightly less mouth-watering tort law, as in T-O-R-T. Skipping past the lawyer jargon, the tort law is what's used when somebody does something irresponsible that causes harm to someone else. Hit your head on one of those low-hang lamps at Starbucks? Call up that tort lawyer. Twist your ankle in a hole dug by construction workers? Get ready to testify in tort court. Doctor accidentally prescribe you Viagra instead of Vicodin? Well, it sounds like you've got an interesting night ahead of you. But you get the point. All kidding aside, tort law is responsible for doubling the average healthcare insurance premium in the past 10 years. According to a White House report, the average American family pays $13,000 for health insurance. They should be paying half of that. As the American Medical Association president, Dr. James Rohack, puts it, the status quo is unacceptable. So that's one paragraph. Now let's look at the second one. This one came right after it. We have all thought to ourselves at one point or another, why are insurance premiums so expensive? You can thank tort law for that one. You see, every practicing doctor pays upwards of $55,000 each year for medical malpractice insurance costs just to make sure that they are covered in case they are sued under tort law. The staggering cost of this malpractice insurance is pushing doctors away from seeing patients. Instead, all they're seeing is courtrooms. According to the Physicians Foundation, an alarming 1 in 10 doctors nationwide will be leaving the industry within the year because they simply can't make ends meet with growing insurance rates. Take Dr. Scott Berlin, for example. For 15 years, he's delivered babies to thousands of mothers, but rising insurance costs have forced him to abandon expectant families and have driven him away from what he loves most, helping people. You can't do enough deliveries to pay this. It's undoable at this point, he explained shortly after he recently closed his office. Since 1994, the average award in medical malpractice lawsuits has tripled to $3.5 million. And as a result, the Association of American Medical College warns that there will be a shortage of 150,000 doctors in the coming years, specifically because of high insurance rates. Doctors can't do what they love, save lives, and help patients without some change. We've got to let them focus more on being doctors and less on being lawyers. So, I hope what you're seeing here in these two paragraphs is the speaker's doing a great job of establishing a root cause to a problem that actually is pretty generic: high healthcare costs. If you're to just say you're going to talk about that topic, most people would say, good luck. That is such a huge and vast topic. Good luck trying to come up with something specific about it. But you can see here that he does a very good job of finding an inventive topic, right? Something specific and unexpected. Most people would not think that legal aspects have anything to do with high healthcare costs, right? But he's doing a great job of showing an unexpected culprit to a problem, of showing an unexpected root cause, and then having lots of specific data points throughout that substantiate his harms. From those two paragraphs, you get a clear sense of what the problem is, what the root cause of that problem is, and what the consequences are on society. And that's what you need to be doing throughout your harm section. Next, and this one will probably feel a little bit newer for you: inherency. Now, this is an odd term that actually comes from debate, and we'll learn more about it when we get to debate, but I want to define it right here. Inherency is an explanation of the barrier, right? Why hasn't this problem been solved in the past? What has been frustrating attempts to solve the problem? What is the root cause of why the problem isn't being fixed now? Oftentimes, the inherency and the root cause to your problem actually overlap greatly. But the reason I want to give this a specific terminology here is because it helps you to define what's often a self-interested culprit. So the best examples of inherency stories, right? The best examples of why a problem isn't being fixed, despite the fact it's so big, is typically lobbyists or corporate greed, or politicians focus on re-election, or attitudes or biases within society, or outdated policies, or resource shortages, etc. What I'm trying to get at here is there's actually a logical tension in an original advocacy. If the problem is really as big as you say, why haven't any steps been taken to fix it now? And that's what inherency is about. And providing that level of culprit and root cause to your speech, it actually really helps the entire topic. So let's look at an example. With the opioid speech, for instance, which you all already read, the harms itself were not particularly surprising. Most people know that the opioid crisis is serious and that it's become an epidemic. Now, this speech did a good job of making this topic applicable to the judge by explaining that the crisis isn't just affecting people that we typically think of as drug addicts. His argument was that anybody who gets injured and ends up in a doctor's office might end up becoming addicted. But to hammer away this point and reveal the horrifying injustice that is going on, he emphasized an inherency story, that the reason nothing is being done, the barrier, is that pharmaceutical companies have been spending billions of dollars lobbying both politicians and doctors to keep pushing their products, regardless of the detrimental effects on health, onto innocent patients. Notice how much more powerful this story becomes once you realize that it's not just there's millions of people being addicted to opioids, and that's bad, but all of a sudden you find out that it's because of pharmaceutical companies spending billions of dollars on lobbying to both doctors and politicians that these drugs have been pushed to so many patients regardless of the detrimental health effects. That becomes horrifying, right? And so if you can find a culprit like that, a reason why why the harms of your speech are being perpetuated right now, a reason why the harms are not being fixed right now, that is really, really powerful. It helps to make them more concrete and helps to define a culprit, which makes it inevitably easier for a judge to grasp as opposed to just a big and abstract problem like millions of people being addicted to opioids. It's easier to imagine evil companies pushing drugs onto patients as opposed to just an abstract problem of millions of people being addicted. Another great thing about inherency is that it can really help to set up a specific plan that would solve for your harms. So, for example, there's a speech on sugar from a varsity member of the team. Now, if you were to just stand up and say that sugar is harmful to our health and that we need a way to fix it because millions of people are eating too much sugar, which is leading to huge obesity rates and causing lots of health problems and economic costs in America, well, that just sounds like a big, abstract, and insurmountable problem. Most audience members would probably think that the fault there lies with consumers who are buying too many sugary products and eating too much sugar. Now, how could the federal government legislation actually fix anything like that? You couldn't ban all sugary products, and you can't dictate what people do or do not eat. However, in this speech, the student focuses on the deceitful labeling practices that food companies take to make their products seem healthier than they actually are, and to make them seem as if they have no sugar. For instance, he talks about the nefarious ways that companies split sugar into multiple ingredients that have scientific-sounding names to make it seem like there is 0 grams of sugar in a product. Moreover, they advertise directly to kids extensively. They spend millions of dollars making sure kids see colorful commercials and cartoon characters so that those kids get addicted to sugar at a young age. They'll urge their parents to get these sugary cereal. Their parents will eventually cave. And yes, this speaker did a great job of showing how addictive sugar can be when you get used to consuming it regularly at a young age. So all of a sudden, this big abstract problem of just millions of people eating too much sugar has become a lot more concrete and specific. We're being tricked into eating sugar when we think we're often eating healthier foods, and that's having devastating effects on our health. And the culprit there, the reason the problem isn't being fixed, is because of companies preying on us and tricking us. So instead of trying to fix the way that consumers choose the foods that they buy, his solution can now be very concrete about cracking down on deceitful labeling and advertising practices in the food industry. It makes the speech much more concrete and tangible and believable. So I think it's really important to develop a strong inherency story that finds a specific culprit that is the root cause of your problems. It makes the speech much more interesting, it makes it far less abstract and intangible, and it makes it very clear what needs to be fixed in terms of the current systems in place. So where does inherency go in your speech? Honestly, it depends on the speech. Sometimes I've seen it go at the beginning of the speech because it helps to explain the root cause of the problem, and sometimes I've seen it go later after the harm section, after the problems and the impacts are established. In general, I would say that if your problem is something that most people already know about, you want to put inherency earlier because it will keep the speech original and interesting. But if the problem isn't well known, then you can probably put inherency later in the speech. For instance, in the sunscreen speech, you can't put inherency first because you haven't even convinced anybody yet that sunscreen is a problem. But with opioids, everybody knows that's a problem, right? So in that case, it's smarter to put inherency first to show that pharmaceutical companies are the problems, establish that culprit, and then show the injustice of what these pharmaceutical companies have done. So that's going to be a big thing I'm looking for, guys. I really want to see a strong inherency story that helps to develop a strong root cause, right? Finally, the final section is solvency. And what I mean by solvency is just proposing a plan and proving that the plan would solve the harms. So your plan needs to be a concrete piece of legislative proposal that is backed by evidence and experts. The worst thing I see in OA speeches is you define some big abstract problem like rising healthcare costs or sugar addictions in the US or opioid addiction rates. And then you just, out of nowhere, come up with a plan that feels like a magic wand that doesn't seem to address the root cause, right? The way to make sure your plan does not feel like a magic wand is twofold. One, make sure you are addressing the root cause of your harms. If you do not define a root cause, then it'll just feel abstract. It'll feel like a magic wand. For instance, if the state champion's speech on the tort law had just talked about rising healthcare costs without ever getting to tort law, just saying healthcare costs have gotten too high, this is unacceptable, it's making it so that millions of people are unable to have basic healthcare because they can't afford the premiums, and then all of a sudden he were to just come up with a solution at the very end of his speech, well, guess what? Healthcare costs are such a huge problem that judges are going to be very skeptical that a speaker could just magically solve that in about 1 minute at the end of a speech. But since he made his speech about tort law being the culprit that is leading to high healthcare costs, well, all of a sudden, reforming the tort law aspect of it becomes a lot more believable. And we're going to look at that in a second. The other thing you need to do is make sure that you are backing up your plan with actual experts and explanations and evidence, right? It's not enough to just come up with a solution on your own. You actually need to show that a really smart individual has thought of this and proposes this and has good logic and reasons why it would work. One of the best ways to support your plan, by the way, is to show that there are empirical examples. And what I mean by an empirical example is your plan being implemented in real life somewhere and it working. Typically, you can point to other countries, right? Perhaps Canada implemented a plan like this, or perhaps a specific state out of the 50 states implemented a plan like that, and it worked. If you can show that there are empirical examples of your policies working in other places, that's a very compelling way to show that your plan will actually work. So, let's take a look at what the state championship speaker did in his speech on tort law and healthcare costs. This is his solution paragraph. He says, "So what's the secret to success? Take away the reason to go to court in the first place. In our current system, the victim is able to sue for two amounts. The first amount to cover medical bills caused by the mistake, and the second to punish the doctor by hitting them where it hurts, their wallet. But let's think about this. We force every single doctor to pay for expensive medical malpractice insurance, a cost that is pushed onto us. But when one of them finally messes up, insurance buyers like you and me pay for their mistakes. Well, two governments have already found a cure for this epidemic, Australia and the state of Texas. Lawmakers took action after witnessing the same problems we see on a national scale today. In those two places, when a person sues, they can still win both amounts for medical bills and punishment, but now they only get to keep the amount for medical bills. The amount for punishment goes directly to the government and stays away from the wallets of lawyers. The results speak for themselves. Just 5 years after the policy was passed in Australia, health insurance premiums for citizens went down 27%. In Texas, medical malpractice insurance was reduced by 50%. The number of lawsuits filed against the state was cut by 70%, and the state saw a 30% reduction in the number of registered, or 30% increase in the number of registered doctors. Also, budgets could finally be reorganized, and now 430,000 more Texans have health insurance than before. It's the best of both worlds. Victims are awarded what they need, and doctors are still punished for making mistakes. Therefore, I advocate that the United States federal government adopt tort law policies similar to those of Australia and Texas. To continue the success, non-medical awards like pain and suffering should be limited to $250,000 as suggested by the Congressional Budget Office. The bottom line is that when patients are paying for lawsuits and not medical care, we've got serious problems. So notice, at the end of this paragraph, it's very convincing that this plan would work because it's worked elsewhere, and also that the specific policy he proposes has good expert backing from the Congressional Budget Office. That is compelling. And finally, notice that this speech, fundamentally, the harms are about high healthcare costs, but he hasn't provided some sweeping magic wand solution. Instead, it's addressing the very concrete and specific root cause that he's outlined throughout the 10 minutes, which is tort law, and he has a very good specific solution to solve tort law issues, which would then have a cascading domino effect on lowering healthcare costs. That's good. That's powerful. So guys, these are the biggest things to avoid and the things I'm going to be primarily looking for in your outlines for original advocacy. These are far and away the most common and frequent comments I give, so I'm hoping that this year, that by forefronting these three things, we'll be able to avoid them. So the first is a lack of direct impacts that are concrete and ideally affect the judge. This is one of the most basic things of original advocacy. You always need to be proving that your topic is a serious problem that affects huge portions of American society. You cannot just prove that your topic affects a small group. For instance, I saw a speaker try to give a speech on mental health care resources in prisons. Yes, it's probably absolutely a problem that we don't have good healthcare resources to help prisoners struggling with mental health issues. But when you give a speech against someone who is talking about why tap water across the country is toxic and giving you carcinogenic substances into your body, or how anyone's identity could be stolen, or why everyone's healthcare costs are so high, it becomes really hard to keep your speech interesting in comparison to those. Moreover, you need to be constantly substantiating and quantifying your harms. It's not just enough to assert, trust me, the consequences are dire. They're really big. Notice how all of the OA speeches we've looked at so far give very specific numbers. You've got figures for how much healthcare premiums have been raised, for how big the doctor shortage is going to be, for how many people are dying from the opioid epidemic, and how many people are becoming addicted, for how toxic our water has become, etc. Now, your speech cannot be exclusively about data and statistics. That'd be super boring, but it's very important that you have these statistics in your speech to make it clear exactly how serious your harms are and to make sure that they are quantified. Next, second thing I'm really looking out for here is to make sure that you have a clear root cause, right? One of the biggest mistakes I see is a lack of a clear root cause. Oftentimes, I see students just talk about impacts without any clarity about what is causing them. So again, imagine the tort law speech if the speaker just stood up and talked about the harms of super high healthcare costs. Healthcare costs are absolutely a big enough harm to bring into an OA, but if he never gave the explanation of tort law, the audience would be totally confused why healthcare costs are so high. It's not enough to just establish a problem in the abstract. This is why I oftentimes think that climate change speeches are a little tricky, because that's such a big and abstract problem to solve in just 10 minutes. Also, it's political, but we don't got to get into that. The reality is you need a very specific take on the root cause of a problem. And that's going to help you to establish a reason why those harms are occurring. The heart of a good OA is always about addressing the reasons why the harms are being perpetuated, rather than just proving that there are really big harms. That's a really important idea, so let me repeat this, and dear God, you should have this written down in your notes. The heart of a good original advocacy is always about addressing the reasons why harms are being perpetuated, rather than just proving that there are really big harms in the abstract. Just proving there are big harms is not enough. It's all about showing the fascinating and unexpected root cause and providing a solution that addresses the root cause. The final thing I'm looking for, and the biggest mistake I see, or one of the big mistakes I see, is a disconnect between harms and solvency. It seems as if you have some really big abstract harms on the one hand, and then you have a magic wand solution on the other that doesn't seem like it actually solves the harms that you've stated. Like I mentioned above, this almost always occurs when it feels like your solution just came out of nowhere. The way to make your solution believable is to make it clear that it's addressing a very, very specific root cause, and a good inherency story can really help to connect your harms and your solution. It's hard to convince a judge that you can just magically think of a solution to fix healthcare costs in America, But if you show that this very specific root cause tort law is the culprit that's leading to such high healthcare premiums, then your solution becomes more believable. Likewise, it's hard to convince a judge that you'd be able to stop drug addicts from taking opioids or stop people from eating sugar. But when you develop a specific root cause, a specific inherency story about the way that greedy companies are lobbying politicians and doctors to push their addictive substances on unknowing patients, or that companies are being deceitful in their labeling and advertising practices, well, then it becomes much clearer what a concrete solution would be. And it makes it so that your harms and your impacts can actually be connected to a specific proposal to fix them. Then it becomes about stopping the ability for companies to lobby politicians and doctors, which seems very concrete and feasible. Or it becomes about stopping companies from being able to mislabel the ingredients on food, or from stopping them from being able to advertise to kids. So hopefully, guys, this has helped to provide a lot more clarity about what I'm looking for and how to have a strong original advocacy speech that doesn't feel like pie-in-the-sky attempts to solve huge abstract problems. The key is about making it very concrete, gentlemen, and that's what I've tried to articulate within this video. Hopefully it helped. If you have more questions, I strongly recommend reaching out to the varsity guys, coming to those coaching sessions on Tuesday, Thursday at lunch, or Friday after school, or finding time to meet with me or chat with me at some point. I'm always more than happy to help.